Democracy now. Those are the words written on signs held by young Israelis in the streets of Tel Aviv on Saturday. Waving rainbow flags and carrying torches, thousands of protesters marched against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's new government, considered one of the most right-wing in the country's history.
I came to protest to defend my future as an Israeli and as a Jew that wants to live in a democratic and safe country.
I'm sure that these demonstrations will grow and grow and grow, and at the end will oust this government.
Netanyahu took office last month after winning the elections back in November. The 73-year-old prime minister, who is fighting corruption charges in court, has served as premier longer than anyone else. He is now at the head of a coalition with extreme right and ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties. The new government has announced worrisome policies that include expanding settlements in the occupied West Bank, introducing a program that allows parliament to override decisions of the Supreme Court, and social reforms that are raising concern among the LGBTQ community.
And we can see right now many laws being advocated for against LGBTQ, against Palestinians, against larger minorities in Israel. And we are here to say loud and clear that all of us, Arabs and Jews and different various communities inside of Israel, demand peace, equality, justice for all of us, and that this is the home of all of us, and we're going to fight for it.
The opposition has accused the government of endangering Israel's entire legal system and says the latest reforms undermine its democratic institutions.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Thomas Friedman, in a recent New York Times op-ed piece, wrote that it's been obvious that this Israeli government would go to extremes that none before it ever dared. With no real guardrails, it would take the United States and world Jewry across red lines they never imagined crossing, eliminating hope of a two-state solution and bringing Israel to the edge of civil war. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's far-right coalition's assault on the country's judiciary would remove almost all legal restraints on his government. The president of Israel's Supreme Court calls it an unrestrained attack on the legal system, which would render the democratic identity of the state of Israel unrecognizable. Israel's dilemmas, however, are not just theirs alone. They are the dilemmas of much of humankind. Elected autocrats in many parts of the world are succeeding in weakening the rule of law so they can trample on human rights, silence dissent, and punish political enemies. Months of unprecedented popular uprisings, mass protests, and a general strike by a huge cross-section of Israeli society has forced Netanyahu to pause his political agenda, at least temporarily, for now. As the fight for Israelis' democracy continues, concerns for the physical safety of Palestinians have grown. The far-right coalition has been transparent in its rhetoric about warning the Palestinians, wanting to harm, and have endangered their physical safety. The far-right coalition has been transparent in their rhetoric concerning the Palestinians. Can democracy be saved in a Jewish state? Peter Beinart, editor of the Jewish Currents, argues that a genuine liberal Israeli democracy that included Palestinians as full partners would find a vast reservoir of new allies and develop a far clearer moral voice. Ultimately, a movement based on occupying or depriving other people of their rights cannot successfully defend the rule of law or be a successful democracy. Only a movement for equality can bring it back from the brink. I'm so pleased to welcome one of the clearest moral voices in American Jewry today to the radical imagination. Rachel Timoner is the senior rabbi of Congregation Beth Elohim in Park Slope, Brooklyn. She's launched several social justice initiatives, including a dismantling racism community organizing team, a refugee task force, and is the co-founder of New York Jewish Agenda, formed to promote issues of social justice, fighting anti-Semitism, and supporting a democratic vision of Israel. Last year, Rachel was one of the 55 women rabbis meeting with Mayor Adams, demonstrating that New York Jews have women leaders and a progressive liberal agenda. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed Breath of Life, God as Spirit in Judaism, and All Who Can Protest, a rabbinic call to end the American gun violence epidemic. So, Rachel, thank you so very, very much for being here. We've tried to get you on now. It's almost a year. Oh, so I'm very pleased and blessed to have you here to dialogue and discuss what's been going on in Israel and within the American Jewish community as well. So
thank you, Jim. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Terrific. Well, before we get to Israel formally, let me just ask you, in doing some reading and research on you, tell us a little about your own Jewish background and your feelings or statements early on that your own Jewish education was formerly rather vapid and materialistic. I don't know if I'm quoting it exactly here.
No, that's exactly right.
Every single day was that way. But so what transformed you into this this having this prophetic voice and of activism and radical imagination here and so on? All right, so.
Yeah,
background. Okay.
Someone else quoted that back to me recently, and I realized I was not very careful with my words, but it's true. I grew up in Miami, Florida. I was born in 1970, so I was in Hebrew school, and then from the kind of mid 70s through the mid 80s, and the environment was really a lot about what you wore and what kind of purse you had and what kind of jewelry you had and how your makeup was. And it just didn't feel like it was about anything. And I was really alienated. I grew up really, really alienated from synagogue and structured Judaism, organized Judaism. I always felt really proud to be a Jew. I felt like it was really important to stand up for being Jewish. I wore a Jewish star, like a big Jewish star in college, and was like really important to me to identify very openly and clearly as a Jew, and to stand for the kind of values that I did associate with Judaism, which was about always thinking about who's the stranger and who's oppressed and who's at the margins, and standing with them. And when I went to college, I got really involved. I had already been a little bit involved as a teenager, but in college, really quite a lot in community organizing and social justice work and anti-racism and feminism. And I came out as a lesbian in college and moved out to California and started doing that work full time. I worked in a variety of different nonprofit organizations and kind of movement building groups.
Right.
And was not connected to the Jewish world at all from my bat mitzvah, which was like my last day really being in a synagogue, till I was for about 10 years. Really? And in my early 20s, I started seeking spiritually. I started really having a need to explore, what did I believe about God? What did I believe about the meaning of human life, our purpose here? And it led me to meditate. And I was influenced by some Buddhist meditation teachers, and then like Thich Nhat Hanh, for example. And then from that experience, realized I come from a tradition that perhaps I did not see fully as a child, that I perhaps was not mature enough to understand or apprehend, and that I promised myself that I would find my way back to a synagogue and that I would explore what Judaism had to offer me. So in my mid-20s, I did. And actually, you mentioned Michael Lerner a minute ago. The first place I walked into was Michael Lerner's new place that he was starting in San Francisco called Beit Tikkun. Walked in there, amazing. And was just immediately moved. The music, the spiritual life there just touched me very, very much. And I realized that was just going to be the beginning of a major exploration in my life. And for the next decade, I did that. For the next decade, I delved into Jewish life. I tried on Shabbat as a 25-hour practice. I in-depth Torah study. I experimented with all kinds of different aspects of mitzvot and halakha. I just kind of tried it all on, and made my way at that time to Congregation Shar Zahav, which is an LGBT synagogue in San Francisco, where I ended up being on the board, and I ended up teaching in the religious school, and I ended up leading services and got really involved. And only really a decade into that process did it occur to me that I might want to go to rabbinical school. I felt, a little bit like an imposter in that I didn't grow up with such sense of deep roots and love of Judaism. So I felt like, who am I really to think about being a rabbi? But explored that a little bit and ended up feeling very much that it was a way for me to explore my spiritual life, perhaps lead in a spiritual way, but also live out my sense of justice calling, which is very core to me, that I could combine those things. I could combine spiritual life and justice in the rabbinate. And from the moment that I decided to apply to rabbinical school, it has just completely flowed. Like, I have just been so grateful. I mean, really so grateful to be able to give my life to this. I feel just incredibly, I feel like I have the best job in the world. I feel incredibly grateful to do what I do. And it's going well. So I love it.
No, but let me just go back just a couple of things, because you said you deeply identified as a Jew, but you then just said that you hadn't really had deep family roots.
Oh no, I meant that I didn't grow up loving Judaism, enthusiastic about Judaism. I left the synagogue when I became bat mitzvah. I didn't stay in my teen years. I didn't go to Jewish camp. I didn't go to Israel as a kid. I just felt like I didn't have some of those roots that other people have, that and then had that decade from 13 to 23 where I really had very little. I mean, the only thing I really did was organize a feminist Seder every year, and Chag Sameach by the way. But so I didn't really I just didn't feel like I had the kind of grounding that one ought to have as a rabbi. And so I had catch up work to do. I had to kind of work doubly hard to make sure I had that foundation.
And your grounding was in Reform Judaism? Was that the synagogue you went to as a child?
Yes, I grew up in a Reform synagogue, and then when I was exploring in that decade, I was in all different movements of Judaism. I explored all different movements, and I thought about rabbinical school in a variety of different movements and post-denominational seminaries. But I ended up finding my way back to the Reform movement, and it ended up feeling like this was the place that alienated me, and this, therefore, is the place where I belong, and where it's always itself. The Reform movement is always moving and changing and growing and expanding and re-embracing tradition, and that there was there was a fit there for me to do the kind of change work I wanted to do in the place that was my home.
And I must also be fully transparent that I've known Michael Lerner for 35 years myself, and listening to him also transformed my own background much toward what you were talking about, although I've been always politically active, but I never quite put the prophetic, my prophetic Jewish roots into the political activity that I was involved in. And as I've gone on, I've done more and more of that. So we're on it sounds like somewhat similar journeys and so on. And I also, as people on the show know, and our audience knows, that Cornel West has been on a number of times, Susanna Heschel, Reverend Barber. So we've identified with those sorts of spiritual progressives who are also really out there putting themselves on the line, and as Reverend Barber puts it, standing in the breach and so on and so on. So, all right, and then your father was also very much involved in Jewish philanthropy.
That's true.
Right.
My dad was a CEO of an airline when I was little. He was a businessman, and he got very involved in Miami Jewish Federation and raised a lot of money to support Israel in those years, and then all kinds of social justice causes, and was always, a progressive person, and really was involved in identifying Jewishly, but primarily through philanthropy.
So, and your mom was also
right there with him on that.
Right. Yeah. We'll come back to those, your father in a few minutes, and we'll also come back to. I'd like to talk to you a little about the work of perhaps Leila Berman and her work on the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex.
Oh yeah.
She's been on the show, and so, but we'll get back to that. I wanted to just establish sort of, the groundwork here, foundation of your background. So you went to college where?
Yale.
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So you moved from sunny Florida to I don't know, semi-sunny. Yeah.
Yeah.
It gets sunny. Was that but the real important significance came in your political activity out after you graduated from Yale, when you were in California, correct?
Well, I mean, at Yale, I had a really formative experience in that Yale is built like a fortress. It has iron gates with spears at the top, and it has pointy spikes at the top of the gate, and it's like a fortress. And I one year I was living in the dorms, and out my window was New Haven, like right across the street, right out the window, and the neighborhood that it was in was like incredibly depressed. I was there late 80s, very early 90s, and New Haven was incredibly depressed, and there was, there were on my block, there were people selling crack, there were people in prostitution, there were people, like really down and out, like really down and out. And I would contemplate, like, what put me inside these gates, and what put the people that I can see right now out my window outside these gates, and the difference between being on one side of that wall and the other side of that wall was everything was open to me. The world was open to me. Anything I wanted to do was available to me. And just across the wall, the people who I was looking at right there had almost nothing open to them. And that shaped me in a way. I promised myself from that experience that I would never forget it, and that I would basically live my life trying to change that equation. It's not right.
Right. And so within the terminology that Cornel West uses so much, radical love and the poor people's movement, identifying with the poor and the suffering of the world and so on, where does this fit into the Jewish prophetic tradition? And if we may, how is that operating in Israel today?
Well, so starting with the first part of that question, it's so present in Judaism. I mean, we're speaking right now. I know this will air after Pesach, but we're speaking, it's Erev Pesach. Tonight is the Seder. And my gosh, we chose as a people, to have our primary narrative be the narrative of slaves going free. And that to identify with slaves who went free. Like that, we decided to have that be the story. We could have had Mount Sinai be the main story. Meeting God, getting the 10 Commandments, that could have been the main story. That was an amazing story. We could have had wandering for 40 years and finding the promised land be the main story. But We chose instead, the main story is that we were slaves. Avadim hayinu, we were slaves and we went free. And why? And what is the lesson of that? Therefore, more times than any other mitzvah in the Torah, 36 times, not oppress the stranger. You know the heart of the stranger. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. Love the stranger. You know the heart of the stranger. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. 36 times, some version of that appears in the Torah. It's the most repeated mitzvah. And that comes out of this story. So who is the oppressed? Who is the marginalized? That was you. And therefore, you are in alliance forever and in loyalty and allegiance forever with whoever finds themselves powerless, marginalized, ostracized, rejected. That is what it is to be a Jew.
Yeah. Now that second part of the question, where connecting that to Israel today and the audience to and not to, looking at what's going on there.
Thank you.
The disconnect between what you've just said. So go ahead.
I think it's, you can see in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel that there was, you can see they wrote in, the voice of the prophets, and they wrote in that Israel would be a place that would respect all people, and that regardless of difference of religion or race or class or, they were aware that they were in an environment where there were going to be some really big conflicts around difference, but that they wanted to be a place that stood by those values. That was what the Declaration of Independence said.
Can I interrupt you just for 1 second? That's really interesting because that's not really talked about much in the media. It's that the mention is that Israel doesn't have a constitution, but what you're talking about, when did this declaration occur? 1948, establishment of the state.
Yeah.
So, okay. Now that was, okay, go ahead. Yeah. So that's
obviously it was an incredibly complicated situation. And we know now from the revisionist historians, we know now very much that there were a number of atrocities that took place in the founding of the state of Israel, that there were that Palestinian people were expelled and didn't just voluntarily leave, and that there were massacres, and we know that now, and forced marches, and so I don't say that about the Declaration of Independence to say that everything was simple and that there was once upon a time this kind of pure set of values. It was always extremely complex, and it included crimes that should not have happened. And there have always been in Israel people standing for those values and fighting for those values. There have always been people who have dedicated their lives to those values, and not just a few, but many. And it has been a long and terrible road in many, many ways, and including the occupation of the West Bank, which began in 1967, and has gone on now for more than 50 years. And I think that what we are seeing in this government is the fact that the settler movement was kind of fed and allowed to thrive by successive governments, not just Netanyahu's government. We are
with American support, in a sense.
And let's be clear, even now, some of the biggest funders of this government are American Jewish institutions. Yes, and so that is very important to point out. Yes, and so, but what's happened now is that extremist perspective has been really kind of nourished for a long time, and now it is finally ascendant. We've got people in this government who had portraits of Baruch Goldstein on their wall. Baruch Goldstein was the Kahanist who murdered 29 Palestinians on Purim in the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, and he's a terrorist and a murderer and a racist. It's an absolutely reprehensible human being who some of these people in this government, high ministers in the coalition, completely valorize him and think of him as a hero. So we are now have the ugliest face of right-wing extremist Jewish nationalism, chauvinism, in government and leading the government. And so we have walked away from the values we were just talking about when you asked me that question, like from those values. The Israeli government now does not represent those values, and its autocratic power grab around the judiciary is just the tip of the iceberg. It is a very, very important matter, because it would give them the kind of power and control to do all the rest of their agenda without anybody moderating that. But it's only part of the problem. The problem is much, much bigger than the desire to kind of seize the power of the judiciary. So the problem is we have an ethno-nationalism that is ascendant and won a majority of votes in Israel right now. And still there are a lot of Israelis on the ground who still stand by these values, who still are about them, who still are working for coexistence and partnership and shared society with Palestinian people. And that is, for me, where my energy and my heart live. We this year at CB at our congregation, when grappling with the question, how do we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut? It's coming up. It's the 75th birthday of Israel. What do we do about this holiday? We can't ignore it. It's the 75th birthday of Israel, but we can't celebrate this manifestation of the dream, because this manifestation is a nightmare. So instead, what we decided to do was start what's going to be an annual thing. We call it the Hope for Our Future Award. We select each year a person or an NGO who are doing the work of creating hope in an exemplary way for our future, a shared future between Jews and Palestinians, and a future of democracy and justice in Israel, and safety and self-determination. And so we are bringing this year, we're bringing a representative of Omdim B'Yachad, Standing Together, which is a fabulous grassroots organization that works with Israeli Jews and Palestinians and is working against the occupation and is working for economic and social justice and is part of the protests that are happening now in the streets. And a representative is coming here, and the idea is we're having a dinner and raising as much money as we possibly can for their organization, giving them an award, and that is how we're celebrating Israel's Independence Day. So
Israelis and Palestinians working together.
Yep.
Women against what's the organization? Women Marching for Peace.
Women Wage Peace.
Women Wage Peace, right? So, so it sounds like you would agree with Meinhardt on this. Or do you? Or he asked that? Wow, loaded question here. Can democracy be saved in a Jewish state? How do you retain? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that this is I love that your podcast is called Radical Imagination, because I think this moment in Israel requires, in order to have any kind of hope right now, it requires radical imagination in any path, right? So Peter Beinart, we actually went to college together. I know him from many years.
Really?
Yes, love him, but we don't agree on this. He, as I understand him now, no longer believes that a Jewish state is the right path. He thinks that what we need is a binational single state. And I do believe that a Jewish state is necessary in the world. And I believe a Palestinian state is necessary in the world. And I believe I understand that that's complicated. I can't tell you exactly how it's going to work out. But similarly, I think one state people also can't tell you exactly how it would work out. Like any path we have now that we could imagine for a future for Jewish Israelis and for Palestinians requires radical imagination, because whatever it has to be, it has to mean that both people have safety. It has to mean that both people have economic and social justice and self-determination and democracy. And we are very, very far away from that right now. And so, some people are saying, well, it's time to give up on the idea of a Jewish state. I myself can't, I do not feel that is the right thing. Look at the world. Anti-Semitism is rising. Jews are feeling unsafe in this country, which has been our safest haven in the world.
Yeah.
The idea that we don't need a Jewish state anymore in the world at this moment to make that decision, that feels to me to be really unrealistic if we care about Jewish lives.
Yeah, just to play the other side on that, people might argue too, what's happening in Israel brings about greater anger at Jews and
I
equating the two and so on. So yeah, it's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
It is, and I have to say, like, I agree with you. What's happening in Israel right now is shameful, and it is unacceptable. It's shameful. It's wrong. It's, today, as we're talking today, there was the Israeli army raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and
Really?
thank God no one was killed, but people were injured and people were arrested. Many people were arrested, and that is utterly unacceptable. It is not representing the Jewish values and Jewish identity that you and I believe in. And I'm long past the idea that American Jews don't have a place to speak up about this kind of thing. American Jews must speak up about this kind of thing. First of all, as you mentioned before, American Jews are funding all of this right-wing atrocity that's happening. Similarly, those of us who have progressive values, those of us who believe in the voices of the prophets that spoke about justice and equality, and the Torah that spoke about the stranger, we must speak as loudly and support NGOs and civil society on the ground that are working in the opposite direction. The funding that's coming for the progressive movement in Israel from American Jews compared to the funding that's going to the right-wingers from American Jews, no comparison, like a fraction. And so if we want Israel to reflect our values and to be something we can be proud of and to have a future that has hope in it, we have to actually actively support our peers on the ground who are fighting for that future.
Now, does that include, really hard questions on the military budget? And
yes, it does.
And putting a stop to some of the weaponry that's being sent.
Yes, I think the time for a blank check for Israel is over. I think it should be over. I think that our aid should be for civil society, for democratic purposes, for
economic programs that could bring people together and so on.
Yep.
I went to an event just a few weeks ago honoring Palestinian scholar Edward Said, and you probably know that he and his friend, the conductor, forgetting his name right now, established an orchestra, East-West Divan Orchestra, where Palestinians and Israelis play together and have given concerts around the world. Actually, of course, it's the Birnbaum. So Birnbaum Said Orchestra. Now, I was astonished to know that the only state that they're not allowed to play in is Israel.
Huh.
I don't know if you knew that. I mean, to me, that's outrageous.
It's outrageous.
Music. And so actually using the radical imagination, maybe you'd like to, this is a real imaginative idea, but why not have a concert? There's a beautiful arena, I understand, in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is very close to Israel, sign out there, and many Israelis could attend. It has a sort of special status, and many Israelis do go there. And why not have that orchestra play there? And aren't these the sorts of efforts we need to be involved in to turn the tide and to push us back from the brink?
I do think that all kinds of kind of cultural cooperation, and partnership between Israelis and Palestinians is really important. I think I've seen authors working together. I've seen musicians working together. I've seen visual artists working together, performing artists working together. Yes, I think that, and I did not know that.
That's what I was told.
that they were not allowed to perform in Israel, and they absolutely should be allowed to perform in Israel. And there are many things like that are really shameful, and it is imperative that we use every bit of power and voice that we have to push for a different kind of future.
You talked about growing anti-Semitism in the world and in America. Do you see that on campus? Do you see that?
Yeah.
That friction happening? I have talked to some Israeli students at Columbia, and also with some of the Palestinian students, various classes, and there's an incredible tension. And I wonder how that can be resolved more humanely.
I think that it's just so difficult because it's very hard right now to defend Israel's behavior, and it's understandable why some people would think that Israel shouldn't exist as a Jewish state. But there are many countries that behave in terrible ways, and there really is no other country that people make the claim should not exist. People might make the claim that it needs to change dramatically. People make the claim the United States needs to, I'm one of them, needs to change dramatically, but we don't say it shouldn't exist. And I think that that's a lot of the conversation on college campuses, is that you have one side saying that Israel as a Jewish state shouldn't exist, and you have one side saying that defending Israel and almost not wanting to even acknowledge that there are any problems because they're, it's so polarized. They're like, you're the pro-Israel, you're anti-Israel. It's like, I believe that Israel needs to exist as a Jewish state, and I'm highly, highly critical. Can't we get into a conversation that's somewhere with a greater nuance, that like, here's a country with many millions of people living in it. Like, what does it mean it shouldn't exist? It's there. And so if we want to actually try to change it, the conversation shouldn't be about eliminating it. And when you get into a conversation about eliminating it, it really is in the realm of anti-Semitism, because there is no other country in the world that people talk about eliminating. And so I do find that there's a lot of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And I think that we really need to be able to speak to, if a person would like to see a better future for Palestinians, then they have to also want a better future for Israeli Jews, because there's no solution here that only cares about one of the people. Like, you have to care about both peoples.
Yeah.
The opposite of what I just said is also true. Anybody who cares about the future for Jews has to care about the future for Palestinians. We are intertwined. We are in the same land. We both have a valid claim to that land. And anybody who says that Jews don't have a valid claim to that land that's also anti-Semitic. Like it's also completely unacceptable to say that Palestinians don't have a claim to that land.
Well, you go as far as saying they're anti-Semitic, though?
Oh yeah.
Just
why? What is the grounds? What is the reasoning to say that they don't have a claim to that land? We know historically, factually, archaeologically that we were there long before Palestinians. Right. That doesn't mean we have more of a right to the land. I'm not saying that, but like, we were definitely there. We were forcibly exiled by the Romans, by the Babylonians and the Romans. We've spent thousands of years longing to go back there. We finally had the opportunity to go back there. Then we were almost annihilated from the earth, but we survived there. Then we were expelled from all of the Middle Eastern countries that, and sent there. Yeah. And why do we have less of a right to be there? We have as much of a right to be there. Palestinians fully also have a right to be there. Yeah. So any realistic effort about either people, like wanting to promote the well-being of either people, has got to start there. The other people, the other group that's there, and in its legitimate right to that place too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you on that. I taught at Yeshiva University as well as John Jay College, so I've been involved in criminal justice reform. Can you speak a little about some of the activities you've been involved in? Because that's where I originally contacted you about. And so I'm interested. And the systemic structural racism that you also bring into that's a whole other topic that is somewhat resisted by some Jews as well. So, so you're carrying on important tradition. As you know, Cornel West and Michael Lerner wrote a book called Let Jews and Blacks Let the Healing Begin, which I used, by the way, at Yeshiva, and it was great success. So, but anyway, tell us a little about some of your activities.
Yeah, well, when I first got here, I arrived here in 2015 from California, and that was the year that Donald Trump became a candidate for president. And I right away saw, oh my, and also that was Black Lives Matter was really happening then. And I thought, okay, I'm new here, but the first thing we've got to do is talk about systemic racism. We've just got to. And so we did a study series. We actually had the incredible privilege and pleasure of having Toni Morrison come and speak about her last book before she died. And when she came, I thought, like, there's no way I'm going to have Toni Morrison come into my sanctuary and not then build a program out of it that like leads to some kind of long-term good. So we did a four book series after her, studying systemic racism in America. There were a couple hundred people involved in that process, and out of that created an organizing team called the Dismantling Racism Team that works on changing the criminal legal system in the state of New York, and was part of the Raise the Age campaign for criminal responsibility, was part of the bail reform campaign, multi-year campaign, was part of probation and parole reform, trying to close Rikers, all of those things. And then after like a lot of years of that work, also working with our DA, Eric Gonzalez, on some of his commitments around racism, out of that work, I ended up realizing like that's good, and we've been part of all the coalitions, and I think we've been useful contributors, but I want to do this work in partnership with the Black community. I don't want to just do it as us, and so I wanted to build relationships with a Black pastor in a Black church, and got to know Reverend Robert Waterman in Bed-Stuy at Antioch Baptist Church, and we've now for the last several years been building a relationship between us and then between our congregations. In fact, they're going to be here tomorrow night for Seder. But our work is not just about relationship building. It is about relationship building.
Right.
It's got three levels. One is relationship building, just like knowing each other, being in each other's spaces, breaking bread, all of that. The second is very real, direct, unflinching, and committed conversations about racism and anti-Semitism, and trying to understand each other and trying to grow our collective consciousness about both things and how they operate and how they interact. And then the third piece is building trust through all of that, such that we then can go into action together to change things in our city as partners. And we've been having a lot of those conversations. We've been doing a lot of the relationship building. We're now at a point in this year where we're going to start doing some trips together to our plan is to go to the lynching memorial and the what's it called, the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, and we're also going to go to the Holocaust Museum in DC, as well as the African American Museum there, and basically just to really kind of have experiential learning together, as our two communities together, and then out of that, and we may even go to Israel together. Out of that, then the next thought is to do some very significant work around racial and economic justice in Brooklyn.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you. What do you've established a good working relationship with Mayor Adams? You think that he's well, tell me.
Yeah, so when Mayor Adams was elected and he appointed his Jewish liaisons, they were Orthodox men, and I was asked by a reporter, like, what do you think? And I said, well, that's fine as far as it goes, but he's missing out. He has two or three liaisons, and none of them were in any way part of any progressive part of Judaism. And I said, he's just not going to hear from the majority of Jews. Like, he's just not going to know what we think. He's not going to be in relationship with us. And I wish he had chosen somebody who connected in any way to the vast majority of Jews in New York. Right. And so then his office called and said, we want you to set up a meeting and invite all of the women rabbis of New York to come meet with the mayor. And I thought, I wonder if he thinks there are like 5 of us, because he might not actually know when he says all the women, there's like 100 women rabbis in New York. So I thought, well, I'm not going to correct him. I'll just invite all the women rabbis in New York. And so 55 women rabbis met with Mayor Adams, and it was actually a really fruitful conversation. He listened deeply and respectfully. There were women representing who were from all 5 boroughs. They're representing every kind of congregation, including the very largest congregations in New York are led by women. There were deans of 3 rabbinical schools who were women. And so it was like really important for him to get the sense of the breadth and the size of our communities. And I started out by laying out for him, in Brooklyn, which is the most Orthodox of the boroughs, still 60% of the Jews of Brooklyn are not Orthodox. And in Manhattan, 90% of the Jews are not Orthodox. And like, you're missing out on most of the Jews if you're just focused on the Orthodox community. And I think he got it. And, we talked about like, look, this is the 55 women sitting around the table. We all introduced ourselves like, this is the face of Jewish leadership, just as much as the Orthodox men you've got working with you. So he got it. He heard us. There have since been a number of things that he has said or done that, I don't agree with or support on a number of issues, but we began a relationship, and I think that was worthwhile.
No, I think that it does sound like a good foundation, but I think again, the discussion really, I think you're going to bring is concretely talking about various criminal justice and police actions and organizing that he has been stressing. It seems like he's really trying to have all kinds of things going on all at once here and not have a very clear vision. So he's talking about, he's now talking about cutting budget that will really hinder a lot of people in their social services and and at the same time also talking about bringing back certain units in the past in the police department that have been very, very racist and very, very harmful to those communities. So
we actually include in our meeting with him, we talked about 6 issues, and the number 1 issue we talked about was policing and criminal justice. Yes, exactly.
So all right. So it's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress.
Let's leave it at that. Okay, at this point. Well, we very much will follow that and be of any help we can on that as well. I wonder if we can talk a few minutes about your father and this incredible movie documentary that your sister made about his last flight home, and what that has led you to do in terms of being part of a movement that you didn't necessarily want to be part of. But tell us a little about that and what that means to you and what you're trying to do there, and also what Judaism can tell us about the struggles that your father had, that you're having, that so many Jews and non-Jews have in terms of, dignified death. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So my dad, for people who don't know, there's a film. You can see it on Amazon Prime, and you can see it on Paramount Plus. My sister made a documentary. My father, in 2021, in March and February, decided to end his life. He was living in California. He was 92 years old. He was terminally ill and had been paralyzed for 40 years from an accident when he was 53 years old. And he was getting to the point where he wasn't going to be able to walk again. He couldn't breathe well. He was struggling to breathe. He had COPD and congestive heart failure. And so he decided to end his life. And in California, you can do that. You can, if you are of sound mind and 2 doctors approve it, you can take a drug to end your life. And so in Judaism, there is actually traditionally a ban on doing such things. It's where life and honoring life and prizing life and championing life is what we're all about. And we would never, as a tradition, want to be part of something that would ever cheapen life. And so, but there was no question for me as his daughter that I was going to support him. We all felt that way. We all supported him to make this choice and to do this. And we were with him in his last days and weeks of life. And that's what the documentary is about. And he was just an incredible human being. So the documentary is also like, he's hilarious, and it's very uplifting, and he's very wise, and it's like so beautiful things he says and things we say. And anyway, but your question about what does Judaism have to say about end of life is, what I've come to through this experience, and what the reform movement of Judaism actually has changed its position to support also in the last year, is that what it looks like to honor life in this time in history, when life is often prolonged through medical intervention, like quite radically, when life is often, and death is often significantly longer than it would be if we didn't have many, many medical interventions, that sometimes what it looks like to honor life is to allow a person to end their life. And that sometimes what it looks like to honor life is to listen to the person who's dying, who is saying that they're in agony and saying that they no longer want to be in this world, and saying, especially if they're dying anyway, and allowing them to make a choice and to have agency at the end of their life to conclude their life. And I learned from this, first of all, when I now it's very public, and I also wrote about it. Hundreds of people have written me talking about their loved ones and the agony at the end of their life, and how much they wish they would have had this choice, and how many months and years people suffered unnecessarily. And I've come to really believe that this is something that religion and Judaism should change on, and should consider that our commitment to life and prizing life and honoring life is not compromised when a person is terminally ill, by allowing them to have some measure of power and choice in how they die, if that's possible for them. Sometimes it's not possible for people, but if it is possible for them, and it would give them greater ease at the end of their life, give them a sense of some agency, and perhaps reduce their suffering, certainly their mental suffering, but also their physical suffering, that is merciful, and that it is not contradictory to honoring life.
Very well put. Really very moving, and thank you for those really wonderful words and feelings. Unfortunately, we're about out of time, but where is your congregation? Because I want to come visit. I've been telling you that for months, but we're going to make our way over there. But so where is the congregation? Park Slope?
Yeah, it's Park Slope, Brooklyn. It's Congregation Beth Elohim, fondly known as CBE, and it's this like wonderful, thriving community here, and 8th Avenue Garfield in Brooklyn.
Thank you so very much. We look forward to meeting you in person finally.
I look forward to it.
We miss each other at that play, but we're going to make it very soon. Okay.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you so much, Rachel. It's
Thank
really
you.
been an honor and a real blessing to have you on.
Thank you, Jim. Hugs up.
Wonderful Passover. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you next week on The Radical Imagination.